7 secrets will take any chord progression from sounding basic or even cheesy to extremely emotional. Watch this video until the end and I guarantee every chord progression you write from now on is going to sound incredible. Here's a preview of the chords we're about to build from scratch. I'm Thales and this video is not about the best chord progressions. That was in a previous video that you can find in the cards. This is how to take them to the next level so they can provide beautiful background harmonies for your vocal melodies. Now, emotion is subjective. Everyone's perceptions are gonna be different. And to understand everything I'm about to show you, you only need to know what scale degrees are. Here's the easiest way to understand scale degrees. I want you to think of a major scale. It's made of 7 notes that you can combine to create the chords that belong to that scale. If we take the C major scale, it's all the white keys on a keyboard. Each note from that scale has a number, a scale degree, from 1 to 7, starting at C all the way up to B. And this is the foundation of writing stunning chords and melodies. So what's a chord? You pick some of those notes and you play them simultaneously. Like this basic progression 1, 6, 4, 5 or C major, A minor, F major, G major. I noticed that most beginners build their chords by playing all the notes on a single instrument, and there's nothing wrong with that. I know it's convenient, pianos, synthesizers, and guitars can play several notes at once, but spreading your chord notes among different instruments will make your chord progressions immediately sound more interesting. In fact, most orchestral music has each instrument playing just one note. I'm making sure everyone's aware of that because it opens up lots of possibilities on how to arrange your chords. I want to invite you to think of chord progressions as a bunch of melodies playing at the same time, and when you combine all these parallel melodies, you're actually looking at chords. For instance, if the chords in your progression have 3 notes each, then try to think of them as 3 separate melodies playing at the same time. We'll call each one of these melodies a voice. For example, I'll split those same chords into different instruments: guitar in yellow, piano in blue, and bass in green. These are the same chords as before, but it already sounds entirely different, more interesting, because now we have different timbres and we can perceive it with more clarity and separation between each note. Now the transitions between these chords sound a bit cheesy because there's a big leap between each note and the next. A quick and easy way to make sure your chord progressions never sound cheesy is to smooth out the transitions between each chord. In this progression, each color represents a different instrument, a different voice. Look at the distance between one yellow note to the next, or from a blue note to the next. They may be too far from one another. What if we reorganize the sequence of the notes within each chord to smooth out the transitions so the movements happen in small steps? Did you notice how the transitions are a lot smoother and not cheesy anymore? Let's try that with different instruments. I'll play the before and after. Different feelings, right? The first one has those big leaps. It sounds more intense, there's more energy, but it could also sound cheesy depending on the context. A lot of people ask why their chords sound cheesy. This is the #1 reason. The second version sounds smooth, I feel more tension. Of course, this is subjective, but it will never sound cheesy. It could be a great background harmony for a vocal melody with lots of fun movement. That's called chord voicing, the structure in which you play the chord notes from lowest to highest. I'll explain that. We're looking at this first chord and it's a C major chord made of the notes C, E, and G. If my chord only has these 3 notes, no matter which note's the highest or lowest, that's going to be a C major chord. In this case, it goes from C at the lowest to E to G. That's called the root position because the C note's the lowest one, or the bass note. If I reposition them so that E is the lowest, so E, G, C, that's still a C major chord. But that's a different voicing of the chord. It's called an inversion. Same thing with G, C, E. That's another voicing. They sound pretty similar, but the feeling we get in context is slightly different. Check them out. I'll play a bunch of voicings of the same chord, C major. You You can use any voicing at any time. However, the root position always sound more resolved and the inversions sound a bit more tense. When the lyrics ask for a tiny bit of tension, using a chord inversion may be just what you need. Of course, you can keep your bass in root position and just change the voicings of the other instruments, and that's a pretty common practice. But keep in mind that a bass inversion is an excellent tool to make small tweaks to the flavors and emotions of your chords. If you're a beginner in music composition and you're only using basic chords like C major or A minor and you find that they sound boring, here's how to spice them up. You can add another note to your chords. So instead of 3 notes, the chords now have 4 notes. It's called tetrads instead of triads. Think of it as if you're taking a basic chord and adding some spice. For example, one of my favorite chords is the C major chord with the major 7th. Sounds beautiful and peaceful and lazy almost. Makes me want to go to the beach and just listen to the waves. But change the voicing, turning B into the bass, and you get this. It's a simple inversion and it sounds very different. Maybe it could be used to support a tense transition in the song. And 7ths are not the only notes you can add to your chords. You can add anything if it sounds good. Each note you add that doesn't belong to the triad chord will give it a different character. When beginner producers start putting their chord progressions together on a piano roll, I noticed that most times their chords look like a tiny block. They have the smallest possible interval between one note and the next. And there's nothing wrong with that, but here's an idea. You can spice up your chords by simply spreading them apart, aka open position or spread voicing. Take a look at the C major chord with the major 7th. See how it's in this closed position where all the notes are as close as possible? They have the shortest intervals possible. To turn this into an open position, all we have to do is spread them out beyond an octave. The easiest way is to select a couple notes from the center and move them a whole octave up. In this case, I'll pick the 3rd and the 5th. Listen to the difference between closed position and open position. Doesn't that open up the sound? It gives each note more space, so there's a lot more clarity. You can distinguish everything easily. And you don't have to lock your song to one position or the other. You're free to use them differently throughout the arrangement, and each one will cause a different sensation. And to make it even more intense, you can always double some of the notes, like the root and the 5th, on higher octaves and add more layers of instruments. Hey, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already before I show you the next secrets to turn your chords into memorable harmonies. Another cool trick to change the character of chords is to leave out certain notes on purpose instead of adding more notes. For example, you can leave out the 3rd of a certain chord to hide its emotional content. When you don't want a major chord to sound super happy, don't play the 3rd. I hear that in pop songs all the time. So in C major, since the notes are C, E, G, the 3rd is E. Let's compare it. First a C major chord, then a C chord without the 3rd. Did you get a hint of its emotion? If it's happy or sad or just neutral? Same thing happens with minor chords. When you don't want it to sound too sad, hide the 3rd and it will sound neutral. Here's an A minor chord followed by an A chord with no 3rd. First one is sad, the second is confusing, right? It's discreet, careful, doesn't tell you much. I feel like the 3rd is the heart of the chord. It's where chords keep their true feelings. When they show you their 3rds, they're being honest with you. On the other hand, if you just want to use the least amount of notes in your chords, just what's necessary to state the emotion, all you need to use are the root and 3rd. Leaving out the 5th won't change the feeling of the chord because this note sounds very neutral. It doesn't have its own characteristic sound. It doesn't color the chord unless the 5th is diminished or augmented, which are different kinds of 5th notes that we'll save for another video. Here's the C major chord with the major 7th, but we'll get rid of the 5th on the second time for comparison. It's not that one is better than the other, it's just a different vibe. I feel like leaving the 5th out helps reduce clutter on spicier chords like the ones with the 7th. When you remove the 5th, there's less going on, so it makes it more intimate, more delicate, and it gives the chord more simplicity. There's more separation, it's easier to recognize each note and really savor each one. Works for major and minor chords. keeping the fifth kind of blends them together, so there isn't a strong spotlight on the seventh note, which you may want to emphasize or not. Both chords are very similar. They can be used in the same occasions because this is just a subtle change. If chords were color palettes, these are two neighbor shades of the same color. Sometimes you want the transitions between your chords to be super smooth, and you can do that with embellishing tones. But to keep it super simple so everyone can follow along with no problems, I'll just call these passing notes. These notes are played for a short amount of time just to help transition into the next chord. So it doesn't really matter if they even belong to the scale. The goal is just to reduce the leaps within each voice, reduce the size of the steps in each voice. Remember how chords can be interpreted as a bunch of melodies in parallel? So let's take that same chord progression and make sure the voices always move in small intervals. From the first chord to the second, we're gonna add a chromatic movement. We're gonna add a G sharp that doesn't belong to any of the chords in this progression, and that will cause a momentary tension that resolves nicely when the next chord plays. The reason why I'm keeping this short is so that it doesn't disrupt our harmony. If we let this note last for too long, it may become distracting and may even sound wrong. Now, from the second chord to the third, notice that two voices are staying the same on A and C, and only one voice is changing. It goes from E to F, so they're as close as it gets. I actually won't add any movement here, it's already great. But from the third chord to the fourth, every voice has to change notes. I don't want them all to change at once, it's not fluid. I want the listeners to notice that each voice is independent from one another, like separate independent melodies. So I'll take the top voice and start descending early from F all the way down to D. I'll actually anticipate the D note from the fourth chord while the third chord is still playing. So again, that note creates a bit of tension for a moment, and that tension gets resolved on the next chord. Here's the full progression with each voice on a different instrument. Will these embellishing tones add movement and make your music more elegant? Yes, but they will also make it busier. If you overdo it, it can become chaotic and confusing. I try not to move more than two voices at once, whenever possible, so the listeners will understand every movement. And remember, these are not rules. It's not mandatory to have passing notes or to do any kind of voice leading, although it is pretty. And the cherry on the top of your chord writing cake is the pedal point. I've seen people call it drone too. It's when you take a note and you sustain it or repeat it over several chord changes. So over some of your chords, it's going to sound consonant, and over some other chords, it's going to sound dissonant. That's usually done with the bass note, but not always. For example, the song Running Up the Hill by Kate Bush has a pedal point bass. It stays on a C note throughout the whole song, no matter what chord's being played, and you can check that out in the remake I made of that song. The video is in the cards for you. The most common notes to use as pedal points are the first and fifth notes of the scale, tonic and dominant, or both of them at once. Here's a chord progression that incorporates most of the concepts I've shown you in this video, and it also has a pedal point. The chords move, but the pedaling notes stays the same, creating different dissonances on each chord. It's an amazing tool to create mood and atmosphere. Here's that same progression with some warm and moody instruments. Now check out a similar progression, but the pedal point is not on the bass, it's on the pad, and it's the fifth scale degree instead of the tonic. So it creates that mood, but at the same time, pedaling a note holds tension, builds drama and expectation, like in the song Driver's License by Olivia Rodrigo. I like to use pedal point during pre-choruses so that we get that relief of resolving it when the chorus hits. The trick here is to make it a dissonance during the pre-chorus, then turn it into a consonance when the chorus hits by starting, for example, with a tonic chord. That's a pretty dramatic effect, so you want to save it for special moments. How about we combine all those instruments and layers now, creating a wall of harmony using the techniques we talked about in this video. See what it sounds like. Tell me if we didn't just squeeze a lot of emotion out of the most basic chord progression. From that point on, it's all about writing tiny variations so it doesn't become a boring loop and adding the great vocal melody on top. Now, if you like to have more exciting bass lines on your songs, then you must watch this next video on how to write amazing bass lines in just 7 steps. I've been a bassist for over 15 years and I promise this video will help you.